There is a historian from the early 1300s from Egypt. His name is Ibn al-Dawadari, and he talked to Mansa Musa in the 1300s, who was the king of Mali, which is not the modern nation of Mali, but it was basically all of West Africa. And he actually traveled. He was a Muslim. He traveled over to Mecca to make his pilgrimage, and he stopped in Egypt, and he talked to this historian, Ibn al-Dawadari, who wrote down in his history that Mansa Musa said that there was an entire Christian section of his kingdom. Now, this is 1300, so this is over a century and a half before the kingdom of the Congo became Christian and before any Europeans ever came to the West African coast. That Mansa Musa said there were Christians in his kingdom, and not only that, but he was the richest person in the world because he controlled the gold trade. And not only that, but the Christian region of Mali, which would have been, Ghana, Senegal, parts of Nigeria, that the Christian section is actually the one that controlled the most of the gold trade. And in fact, he even said that when the Muslims tried to overtake that section to control the gold trade, the gold stopped growing. It stopped producing. And so they left them alone and allowed the Christians to control the gold-rich areas of the Mali kingdom, which is West Africa. So,
what's good, YouTube? Today I want to talk about Mansa Musa and the West African Nazarenes. The reason I want to talk about this is because I just did a video about Yahwism and African spirituality, meaning as far as the African spirituality conversation goes, there was always a recognition of Yahweh, the deity of the Bible, the God of the Bible, in terms of the first recognition of God coming from an Nubian temple, even before the Hebrew scriptures were written. And from that foundation, we see all these Yahwistic traditions through all major corners of Africa before the slave trade starts. So when we're dealing with Yahweh, with the God of the Bible, we're talking about a God that black people were the first to acknowledge, have always acknowledged, and have continued to acknowledge for years upon years since ancient times, all the way to the medieval period before the slave trade. There's some Yahwistic tradition in some form in every corner of Africa, at every major part of Africa before the slave trade happens. You have North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, East Africa, South Africa, as in the country of South Africa, as well as West Africa. When you go from the perspective of not only when God personally revealed himself to African leaders and African pharaohs like Pharaoh Necho in the Tanakh in the Old Testament, or like the Queen of Saba, or just from the foundation of the scattering of the Israelites, how their influence and their interactions with these ancient African kingdoms caused a mutual recognition of their God from a very ancient time. Israelites scattered into Cush, Israelites scattered into Ethiopia, Israelites scattered into Egypt, the Egypto-Nubian temples, or not the Egypto-Nubian, but the Egypto-Israelite temples dedicated to Yahweh in Egypt. So from the perspective of Yahweh and Yahwistic traditions, any sort of tradition that recognizes Yahweh, from the Abrahamic perspective of those who descend from Abraham, who continue to populate and scatter Africa throughout both sides of Christ, as well as those who recognize the Messiah and indigenous others who recognize the Messiah, the Christians or Nazarenes. From those different trajectories, there's always some sort of Yahwistic tradition represented within the continent. When we get to West Africa, we get the perspective of the seed of Israel, who are Sephardic, being settling in the Caribbean and in West Africa, places like Cape Verde and other places after the Spanish Inquisition. So those, that sort of Abrahamic tradition of those who descend from the seed of Israel, represented in Africa even after the time of Christ. In terms of the West Africa recognition of Yahweh, which goes back to the times of the Inquisition, but even before that, in the times of Mansa Musa, the great Islamic king, the one who's said to be the richest man, the richest king, who's often used as a symbol for black power and black wealth and black excellence, right? During this reign of this West African Islamic king, there was a very dominant area of Christians, meaning there was a very dominant community of Nazarenes in Africa in Mansa Musa's time, which is before the slave trade. So that means there were Nazarenes and believers in Yeshua represented within West Africa, as well as the other Yahwistic traditions. And I'm going to actually read the direct source of that now. Now here's the source that Vince Bounty was talking about, and I'll link it in the description. Here's an excerpt from Ibn al-Dawadi's text. I heard the magistrate Fakhr al-Din, inspector of the victorious army, say, I asked the king of the Takor, what is the source like where the gold grows among them? Then he said, it is not in our land which is the property of the Muslims, rather, it is in the land that is the property of the Christians of Trakur. Al-Nasrai, we send to take from them a collection that is due to us and is required of them. These are special lands that produce gold in this way. They are small pieces of various textures. Some are like small rings, some are like carob seeds, and so on. The magistrate Fakhr al-Din replied, saying, why didn't you conquer the land by force? He said, if we conquer them and take it, it does not produce anything. We have done this in various ways, but we have not seen anything in it. But when it returns to them, it produces according to its average. This is a fascinating dynamic, and this is perhaps an increase in the dominance of the Christians. So according to Islamic sources of the time, West Africa, the Mali Empire, during the time of Mansa Musa, this character that is often used as a picture of black excellence and black wealth and black strength and things like that, his gold came from the land of the Christians. Mansa Musa said his gold came from the land of the Christians. And it's not just that. According to the Islamic sources, there was actually a reflection that this community was dominant. There was some kind of dynamic, even spiritual dynamic, where when the gold was trying to be taken by force from the Muslims, it wouldn't produce as much as it would when it came from the Christians naturally. So this shows, before the slave trade, there was a dominant community of Nazarenes, of Christians, of followers of the way within West Africa, which is actually the source of Mansa Musa's gold that we talk about so much as this symbol of black excellence and things like that. So there wasn't just Christians in West Africa, but there were actually a dominant community in West Africa that was the source of the gold of the Mali Empire. I want to speak to this because a lot of times in conscious circles, when you have people that are skeptical of the gospel in the black community, they may be like, okay, I can acknowledge Egypt and Ethiopia, but that's North Africa, that's East Africa. Our descendants come from West Africa. I don't care about the other countries. Well, if we gotta go to West Africa, we clearly see there was a very dominant, strong community of believers, which reflects again that in every major corner of Africa, you have some form of Yahwistic tradition that recognizes Yahweh in some shape, form, or fashion. From the ancient times, from the first recognition of this God coming from ancient Africans to the medieval period. And this reflects during the Islamic times, the source of the gold came from the Nazarenes in West Africa. There is also something to be said as far as the expansion of the West Africa in terms of the ships that Mansa Musa's brother set sail westward. And there's some speculation as if there was early African interactions with America because of that. I believe it sent out 200 to 2,000 ships, Mansa Musa's brother, and never returned from what I understand. Now, I go even far as to say that this is speculative, but had there never been no transatlantic slave trade, the New World, America, would have heard the gospel most likely from ancient Africans, from the Mali Empire, because there was already believers there that was the source of the gold during that time. So had things expanded naturally, had that expansion from the Mali Empire of Mansa Musa's brother actually made contact with America and things had continued on their own natural trajectory, the gospel would have been come to America from the hands of West African black people. I go as far to say that. Had things happened a little differently. Now, no, that's speculative, but based on the records that we have, that's a distinct possibility we should acknowledge, which reflects the fact that there was a Yahwistic tradition, a recognition of Yahweh in every major corner of Africa, especially West Africa, to the point that had there been no transatlantic slave trade, the way the New World got the gospel could have been totally different. So that's worth saying. I also think it's interesting that, according to the Islamic sources, the believers are called Nazarenes or Al-Nazari, because in the Ethiopian church, they call themselves Nasrahi, which is Nazarenes in their language, Ge'ez. So it's just very neat how it seems that in Africa, the Christians, both in East and in West, are referred to as Nazarenes, which is one of the earliest terms, very Hebraic term, to refer to the followers of Jesus, followers of Yeshua. And it's very cool because to me, this also reflects the Hebraic nature of the churches in Africa, whether it be Ethiopia or Nubia or the Egyptian church, the earliest community, how that is sort of said to have started by that tradition, as well as the Lemba people, many of whom are Messianic, who actually embrace the Messiah, who are Levites in the world today. The churches in Africa tend to be very Hebraic because of the ancient Israelite influence and interactions with the continent, which is very interesting to study. And I just think it's reflected in even the verbiage of how they refer to themselves as believers in God through the Messiah, Nazarenes, Nasri in Arabic in the Islamic sources, or Nasrahi in the Ethiopian church. So it's just dope stuff. So whenever anyone believes that black people know about God because of slavery or because of Europeans, that's not true at all. Not only was Africa the first people to actually identify this God as existing in written history, but there's always some Yahwistic tradition, even in the Mali Empire, even in West Africa, representing every major corner of the continent before the slave trade. So when it comes to the God of the Bible, we have to look at the history and not make the colonial stuff the starting point, because at that point, if done knowingly, that could be disrespectful to this continental heritage that we have with this deity from hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of years beforehand. You see what I'm saying? So with that being said, y'all be blessed in the Messiah. Y'all be blessed in the Most High. I want to make this video because this is not public. This is not very known. This is not, this had to get translated from Arabic. You see what I'm saying? So we need to get this stuff out there because this is not big. This is not very well known in the community.